All right, welcome. It's great to have you here. And this is the history of science and religion, or more specifically, history of science and Christianity. Hope you're at the right place. Hope I'm at the right place too. For many centuries, even millennia, religious people, and specifically Christians, have opposed the advancement of science. Why is this? Is because they were blinded by their obedience to sacred scripture and their desire to prove their superstitious ideas, rather than being open to what the evidence of the world around us pointed to. And so over and over again, as brave scientists have sought to throw off the shackles of religious dogma and just discover the truth around us, these religious Christians have opposed them and stopped them over and over again. And the most classic case of this is Galileo. Galileo wanted to show people that the earth was round and that it went around the sun, that it was a sphere, and the Catholic Church just couldn't handle this. So they threw him in a dungeon, they tortured him, and they forbade his books for centuries. Not only that, these religious Christians were so blinded by their dogma, by their superstition, that throughout the Middle Ages, they said the earth was flat. I mean, how stupid can you get? And then when Charles Darwin came along and proposed his theory of evolution and showed how we really got here, this threatened the Christians, the religious people, and they opposed him once again. Over and over again, Christians have opposed the advancement of science, failed to learn their lessons, and sought to prove their Bible rather than accept reality. Or at least that is the story that so many people today believe. If you talk to the average Canadian, a lot of times this is what they will say, or at least they have this framework in the back of their minds. But what I'm here to tell you today is that whole framework is wrong. Historians today universally agree, and I'm not talking about Christian historians, I'm talking about any historians, any respected academic historians and mainstream universities universally recognize that that whole account that I just presented, which is called a conflict theory, they universally agree that that is incorrect. The right word they say to characterize the history of science and religion is not conflict, but complexity. And many times in this complexity, Christianity actually promoted and helped advance the development of Christianity. So what I want to do in this next 45 minutes or so is help explain that. There is a certain element of conflict, but a lot of times the classic cases we know about, Galileo and Darwin, etc., this story has been simplified and distorted to become simplistic and wrong. We don't really understand what was going on there. So I want to help you understand the correct account of Christianity and science. I often do this presentation, or in the past when I've done this, I've taken an hour to present. I need to do this in 30 minutes rather than an hour, so you'll notice I'll be skipping a little bit, but if there's something you want me to address, we'll have some Q&A time and I can bring that up, and I would love for you to do it because there's stuff I want to share. It's just I'm supposed to do this in 30 minutes, not an hour. So one of the first things to realize is historians acknowledge that Christianity played a significantly positive role in the birth and development of the modern scientific revolution. There's a reason that modern science developed in Christian Europe rather than other parts of the world. Other parts of the world did develop a certain degree of technology, like you have a lot of good stuff happening in China and Korea and other places. And they had some limited scientific development, but where it really took off was in Europe. A lot of these early Christians that began the scientific revolution were explicitly motivated by their Christian convictions. Isaac Newton is a great example of this. Now, one thing we should acknowledge about Isaac Newton, he was not an Orthodox Christian believer because he denied the Trinity. He held to an ancient heresy known as Arianism. He kept this secret because he knew he'd get in trouble if people knew about it. But he was still very motivated by his belief in the God of the Bible and spent a lot of his time actually studying theology, studying the Bible, and even doing alchemy too as well. But he did a fantastic amount of scientific work as well. And he is probably one of the Undoubtedly, he is one of the greatest scientists who ever lived, Isaac Newton. His magnum opus, that means his probably most important scientific work, was the Principia, published in the late 1600s. And in the second edition of the Principia, he had a section called the General Scholium. In that, he explicitly explains the role that God played in his physics. Newtonian physics was the framework, the paradigm that all physicists worked in for about the next 200 years. Not until Albert Einstein in the early 20th century did that whole paradigm and framework shift. And Isaac Newton is certainly not the only one out there who was motivated by their Christian convictions to study the world around them. And this view, what I'm saying to you here, like I said before, this is not what some kind of small group of Christians in some backwoods fundamentalist Christian college are saying. This is what mainstream scholars are saying, have been saying for decades. And I want you to understand this, so I have some quotes that I'm going to be showing you throughout my presentation here to see that this is a mainstream view. So let's look at this quote. I need someone to read them for me. Does somebody want to volunteer? Would you like to do that? Is that okay? Can I ask you to read all of them as they come up? I'll tell you when. Is that all right? Okay, great. Let's start with this one.
Pioneers of early modern science, such as Isaac Newton and Robert Boyle, saw their work as part of a religious enterprise devoted to understanding God's creation.
All right, Dr. Thomas Dixon, Professor of History at the University of London. One of the reasons why Christianity played a positive role in the development of science is not simply because these Christians were motivated by their Christian beliefs to learn about God from the book of nature. They talk, there's the book of Revelation, the divine revelation, which is the Bible, but they also had the book of nature. They figured they could learn about God through that. But they were motivated, say, to look for scientific laws because they believed there was a lawgiver. They understood that there was a God who was eternal, unchanging, and he would govern the universe in certain ways that had certain patterns to it that were unchanging. Not necessarily eternal, but unchanging. Because God was unchanging and eternal, he governed the universe in that way. In the Middle Ages, they had the idea of moral laws through which God governed, and this was called natural law. But then they began in the scientific revolution to apply this to the physical realm and say, can we find laws that are not moral in nature, but are physical in nature, and that God governs the universe through these laws? This was a precondition for having experimental science. You're not going to do an experiment and expect it to be replicated again by other people at other times in other places unless you think there are these laws, these unchanging patterns that are uniform throughout nature in all times and all places. They believed that they could find these laws because there was a God that was governing and sustaining and controlling the universe. So that's just one example for you. Here's a quote that kind of supports that, if you could read it to me.
Historians of science have long known that religious factors played a significantly positive role in the emergence and persistence of modern science in the West. Not only were many of the key figures in the rise of science individuals with sincere religious commitments, but the new approaches to nature that they pioneered were underpinned in various ways by religious assumptions.
Okay, so notice this is Dr. Peter Harrison, who is a former professor of science and religion at Oxford University. Oxford University doesn't normally hire crazy backwood religious fundamentalists who are biased and don't know their history, right? This guy is a respected scholar. And so that's why I want you to help understand what I'm saying to you today is not some minority view in academia. This is the mainstream view. You don't hear about it in the general public, but amongst historians of science, this is common knowledge, what I'm saying, right? There's a lot of myths that people believe today, and mainstream scholars, professors at places like Oxford and University, they say these things that I'm talking about. You notice he says they were many of the key figures in the rise of science, like Isaac Newton, were individuals with sincere religious commitments, right? They're very devoted to their Christian faith, to the belief in the Bible. So there was that aspect, but then new approaches to nature that they pioneered, the scientific method, were underpinned in various ways by religious assumptions. And one of those was what I just said. They were convinced that God governed this universe in these patterns that were unchanging, which were essentially the laws of nature. So now we should ask ourselves, well, if this is so clearly true, why is it that so many people today believe in the conflict view, this false view, that science and religion were primarily in conflict? Where did this come from? And historians universally agree that this false idea started in the late 1800s because of two guys, John William Draper and Andrew Dickson White. Those are really the two guys. John William Draper came from England to the United States, and he had a very strong anti-Catholic bias. So he wrote his works trying to make the Catholic Church look bad, and especially with Galileo, and trying to say, look how bad these Catholic people are. They're always opposing the advancement of science. The other guy was Andrew Dickson White. He was one of the founders of Cornell University's first president. Cornell University was the first university founded in the United States that was non-sectarian, non-religious. It wasn't connected with any particular denomination or Christian group, and was not there to train ministers. It was founded purely on secular lines. So he faced opposition because of what he was doing, and this opposition didn't make him very happy, and the way he kind of got revenge is by writing about the supposed history of Christianity and science and how Christians were always opposing science. Historians today look back at their works. They were wildly popular. Many, many editions, many translations. Historians today look back at them and say these books were such bad history that they wonder whether they were deliberately trying to deceive people or whether they had such a strong axe to grind, such a strong bias that it affected their work, their scholarship. So that's how wrong their ideas are. And again, this isn't just me saying or somebody saying that. Here's a good quote from Dr. Gary Ferguson saying that. Sorry, Fernbread. Could you read this?
Well, some historians had always regarded the Draper-White thesis as oversimplifying and distorting a complex relationship. In the late 20th century, it underwent a more systematic re-evaluation. The result is a growing recognition among historians of science that the relationship of religion and science has been much more positive than is sometimes thought. Although popular images of controversy continue to exemplify the supposed hostility of Christianity to new scientific theories, studies have shown that Christianity has often nurtured and encouraged scientific endeavor, while at other times the two have coexisted without either tension or attempts at harmonization. If Galileo and the Scopes trial came to mind as examples of conflict, they were exceptions rather than the rule.
Okay, so let's go over this. He starts off and says, well, historians have always regarded the Draper-White thesis. What is that? Remember I said Andrew Dickson White, John William Draper were the guys who started the conflict thesis, the false idea that I presented to you at the beginning and that many Canadians, Westerners believe, right? So historians have always regarded that conflict thesis, the Draper-White thesis, as oversimplifying and distorting a complex relationship, right? The relationship between science and history. So they've always seen it that way. But in the late 20th century, last 50 years or so, it underwent a more systematic reevaluation. So they scrutinized this more carefully. The result is a growing recognition among historians of science that the relationship of religion and science has been much more positive than is sometimes thought. So amongst the average public, we don't see a positive relationship between them, but there's this real recognition that's much more positive than the average people believe. Although popular public images of controversy continue to exemplify the supposed hostility of Christianity to new scientific theories. What are those popular images? Galileo, Darwin, right? Those are the two big ones. Studies have shown that Christianity has often nurtured and encouraged scientific endeavor. Christianity plays a positive role. You can see that in Isaac Newton. You can see it in other scientists. While at other times the two have coexisted without either tension or attempts at harmonization, right? So they either existed together or, they were positive, right? If Galileo and the Scopes trial, those are the popular images of controversy, right? Come to mind as examples of conflict, and there was some conflict in there. Those were exceptions rather than the rule. That's not the normal way that science and religion have interacted. I don't have time now to talk about the flat earth myth, because this is part of getting through this faster. Suffice it to say, people in the Middle Ages did not believe the earth was flat. Very few people back then believed that. Pretty well they knew it was a sphere all the way back to the 3rd century BC. Although there's a few rare people that did in the Middle Ages, you can find people today who argue for a flat earth. There's a society for the flat earth you can find on the internet. Would it be fair for 1,000 years from now or 2,000 years from now for historians to look back at the people of the early 21st century, us, and say, look how stupid they are. There's these people on the internet who thought the earth was flat. No, everyone knows, at least educated people around the world, know that the earth is a sphere. You can't take these examples of a handful of people on the internet and say they all thought the earth was flat. But that's exactly what Draper and White did to the Middle Ages. They found rare examples of people who thought the earth was flat, and they said, oh, look, they all thought it was flat. It's not true. They knew that the earth was a sphere. Let's look at this next slide here. Can you just read that one quickly?
With extraordinarily few exceptions, no educated person in the history of Western civilization from the 3rd century BC onward believed that the earth was flat.
So like I said, I could talk more about that, but I'm going to do that briefly so we get through everything. What I like to do now is talk about Galileo, because he's often, other than Darwin, he is the classic example of conflict. And I want to acknowledge right off the bat, there was a certain element of religious conflict with a new scientific theory. There was a little bit of that. But I hope you'll see it really can't be reduced to that. There were so many other factors going on, and there was scientific opposition to Galileo as well. One of the first things to realize with Galileo is he was a fairly devout Catholic. He had children born out of wedlock, so that's not very devout Catholic, but he would go to Mass regularly, and he took his faith quite seriously. So he was not some atheistic or non-religious scientist who was opposed by religious believers. And in fact, when he had opposition to him from the Bible, he wrote a whole kind of treatise called the Letter to the Grand Duchess Christina of Tuscany, in which he argued for the fact that the Bible does not have to be interpreted in such a way to say that the earth stands still. And Galileo referred back to church fathers like Augustine. Augustine said, look, we have to be careful how we interpret the Bible. We don't want to conclude certain things about the physical world around us that turn out to be false and make us look stupid. And this was long before Galileo. This was, Augustine was writing late 300s, early 400s, right? So Galileo referred back to people like Augustine and said, look, we don't have to interpret the Bible in this sense. And there was other monks and priests and such who were on his side, even the scientists of that day. Note, though, that the word scientist was not coined until the 1800s. There was no scientist, strictly speaking, then. They were all natural philosophers before that. And a lot of these natural philosophers were clergy members or priests or whatever. Pretty well everybody was a Christian, right, of some type. So you can't just separate, okay, well, there's scientists and there's the religious people back then. They were one and the same. So, but the point is, there was plenty of devout Christians, Catholics, such, who took Galileo's view. Now, Galileo never argued that the earth was a sphere. Everybody knew it was a sphere. That was not the issue. The issue is whether the earth goes around the sun or the sun goes around the earth. That was the question. If you think about it, we all have the benefit of scientific knowledge taught us. But imagine you don't have all the knowledge and schooling that you experience in school, and you're just trying to decide, does the earth go around the sun or does the sun go around the earth? Well, look around you. Do you see the earth moving? Do you feel it moving? I don't feel it moving. But I don't see it moving, but I see the sun moving. So it's kind of understandable why many civilizations throughout history and throughout the earth believe that the earth was stationary and the sun moved around it, right? So one thing to realize, though, that Galileo had other people on his side who took an interpretation of Scripture that said, the earth was moving around the sun. And then there was other people who opposed him, too, as well. Another important thing to realize, the scientists of Galileo's day were opposed. In fact, most scientists were against Galileo. Here's something even better. They did an experiment in Galileo's day to decide whether he was right or whether he was wrong. And that experiment proved that Galileo was wrong. They say, how is this possible? Okay, well, let me explain. There's something called parallactic displacement. To understand this, think of this little experiment you can do. If I put my thumb out here and I look at that clock, my thumb is in a particular position relative to that clock. If I close my eyes, the thumb moves a little bit. It's a particular, one eye, right? I see the clock in one place and my thumb is in another with one eye closed. Now if I open this eye and close the other eye, the thumb shifts in relation to that object that's further away. But I actually haven't moved my thumb. What's happened? My focal point is switched, right? If you move your focal point, things that are closer move in position to things that are farther away. So they knew this in Galileo's day, and they said, look, we can do an experiment to decide whether the Earth is going around the sun or not. If the Earth is rotating around the sun, then it's going to be in one position at one time of the year, and at the other time of the year, it's going to be in a different position. So in the spring, it's going to be over here, and in the autumn, it's going to be over here, right? In the summer, it's going to be over here, and in the winter, it's going to be over here, right? So it's going to be opposite sides of the sun at these different times of year. So they said this is like the same thing like opening one eye and closing the other. You're at different focal points. They said if we look at the stars, we know that some of these stars are closer and some of them are farther away. If the Earth is really moving around the sun, the stars that are closer should shift in their position relative to the stars that are farther away. They said we can do this simple experiment. Let's look at the stars at one time of the year and the other. We'll look for this displacement, parallactic displacement of stars. If we see it, we know the Earth is moved. If we don't see it, we know the Earth is stationary. So what do? They look for the displacement. Nothing. No movement of the stars. This proved Galileo was wrong. The only way Galileo could be right, and this is what him and his contemporaries argued that were on his side, they said, oh, but the stars are so far away that we can't detect this displacement. Now that turned out to be right, and they weren't able to detect this till the 1800s. But in the time of Galileo, this just seemed like special pleading. This seemed like you were not willing to give up your favorite theory. It had been proven wrong, but now you found some fancy way to save your theory. And it was Galileo, give it up. We've proved you wrong. That, I think, is a very important part of understanding the whole story of Galileo. But very few people have ever heard about this. And this is my point about the story of Galileo being so distorted. We should know that the best scientific experiment of that day proved Galileo was wrong. And this is why so much of the scientific establishment was against Galileo. It wasn't simply a matter of the Bible says this, so we don't like you, so you're wrong. Furthermore, there was other issues happening too as well. The book that really got Galileo in trouble was published in 1632. It's called A Dialogue Concerning the Two Chief World Systems. Galileo, the idea of the Earth going around the sun was fine with people as long as you took it as just a way of thinking of things so that you can use it to mathematically determine where the planets and stars are. As long as you just use it as a mathematical device, it was fine. You weren't arguing that this was actually true. And this is the way that Copernicus, who was the first one to propose that theory about 100 years before, he kind of presented it in this way, and it was not controversial. But what became controversial is Galileo, he seemed to start to argue that this wasn't just a mathematical calculating device, this was the way things really were. And he wasn't allowed to defend his theory as true. However, he was given permission to publish this book in 1632. The Pope was his friend. He personally gave him permission to publish this book, but he just couldn't defend this theory as actually true. So what he did is he published a book in which he had 30 characters just debating the issues. So what Galileo was trying to do is say, look, I'm just presenting the arguments for and against. I'm not saying who's right or who's wrong. And he had 3 characters in it: Salviati, Simplicio, and Sagredo. Sagredo was like this intelligent, knowledgeable layman. Okay, not an expert in these things, but just a layman who was kind of neutral and could serve to help move the discussion along. Salviati was a character who took Galileo's view. He argued this new scientific theory that the Earth went around the sun. This was Galileo's view, Copernicus's view. Simplicio, though, took the traditional view that said, no, the Earth is stationary. Now, you might say this is fine, but what's something you notice about Sagredo? That name sounds fine. Salviato, that name sounds fine. What do you notice about the name Simplicio? This is an Italian name, but you can hear it in English. What's the connotation there? Anyone?
Simple.
Yeah, like a simpleton or stupid person or something like that. Now, Galileo insisted he was not trying to insult or offend anyone, but he put some of the arguments of the Pope, his friend, into the mouth of Simplicio. So the Pope, in many ways, felt he got stabbed in the back. Here he gave permission to Galileo to publish his theory, and now Galileo is making him look stupid. It's not very good if you want to kind of be able to publish a new scientific theory and have it considered and accepted, and you stab the Pope in the back, right? A lot of people read this book and interpreted it as having this condescending tone. So this was another factor that was going on that we also don't realize. Here's another factor too as well that many people don't know about. At the time that Galileo was writing, the Protestant Reformation was still something that the Catholic Church was dealing with. And the Catholic Church said you can't interpret Scripture on your own. You need the magisterium, the authority of the Church to tell you what the Bible says. So you don't have chaos. You don't have all these people deciding what the Bible is and all this heresy sprouting, right? This is the Catholic position. The Protestants were saying, no, we don't need the Church to tell us. We can interpret the Bible ourselves. Every man, every woman can read the Bible for themselves. With the guidance of the Holy Spirit, they can know what the Bible says, right? I mean, I'm Protestant evangelical too, so, understand, I'm just presenting this as the Catholic perspective, right? So the Catholic Church is saying, no, the Church decides what the text says and interprets it for people. When Galileo came along, it seemed to be saying this is what the Bible says, or at least could say about the universe. This reminded them of what the Protestant reformers were doing. They were deciding what the Bible says instead of letting the Church decide. That seemed to be the same thing that Galileo was doing here. That was a problem, right? Galileo, it's not your right to decide what the Bible says. You listen to the Church. Sounds like you're not just presenting an idea. You're defending your theory as true and deciding this is the right interpretation of Scripture. So you have all these different factors in play. It's also important to realize Galileo was never put into a dungeon. He was never tortured. We know where Galileo was through all the days of his trial in 1633, the year after his book was published. There's 2 or 3 days we don't know. It's highly unlikely they threw him in a dungeon because all the other days he was staying in these really nice palatial residences. He got nice places to stay. Now in the end he was found vehemently suspect of heresy. So that was bad what the Catholic Church did. They found him suspect of heresy. Let's acknowledge there was a certain element of religious opposition there. And he was placed under house arrest for the rest of his life. He was not put into a dungeon. Now that's also bad, that he was put under house arrest. Mind you, he was old and he had a nice place to stay, so it's not quite as bad as it might sound, but it was still wrong, right? So let's acknowledge this. But let's also recognize we've got a highly distorted version of the events that happened there. We need to understand the truth of what went on. Here's another quote for you, if we can do this and if you could read it for us.
The myths, genuine myths, ideas that are in fact false, but once seemed true, and continue to be accepted as true by poorly educated persons and careless scholars.
All right, now if I had more time here, I would talk about Charles Darwin, but we need to move along quickly, so I'm going to skip Darwin. If you want to ask me in the Q&A time, I can talk about that. What I want to talk about now, though, is the fact that atheists have also been hostile to the development of science when it has threatened their atheism. And what I'm specifically thinking about is the development of the Big Bang Theory in the 20th century. When I say Big Bang Theory, I'm not talking about that TV show, okay? So don't confuse things here. That TV show came long after the theory of the Big Bang, right? I'm talking about the idea that the universe began about 14 billion years ago in a moment of time, or an instantaneous moment. What that was, whether it was a singularity or something else, is controversial, or is still debated by scientists. But that the universe is not eternally old, right? That theory was proposed by Georges Lemaitre, a Belgian Catholic priest in the early 20th century, who looked at Einstein's theory of relativity and said, Einstein interpreted them to mean an eternally old universe. And he said, well, we don't have to interpret them this way. We could understand them in a way that the universe began in a primeval atom. So that theory began with Georges Lemaitre. He was opposed. People said, you're just saying this because you're a Catholic priest, so you wanted the beginning of the universe, right? It's like, no, this is what the evidence points to. But there was still a lot of people who were hostile to that idea, especially Soviet scientists who were indoctrinated with Marxist atheist philosophy. And to show you that this is the case, I've got 2 quotes. We're going to have to skip 2 ahead. There we go. Can you read that first one there?
The origin of the Big Bang itself is not susceptible to discussion. This view of the origin of the universe is thoroughly unsatisfactory. Creationists and those of similar persuasions seeking support for their opinions have ample justification in the doctrine of the Big Bang. That, they might say, is when and how the universe was created.
Okay, so this is written in a magazine or a science journal called Nature. It's one of the top 2 scientific journals in the world. If you get published in Nature as a scientist, you've made it. Okay, it's out of the UK. This guy, John Maddox, is an atheist. He was the editor of Nature. So you have to be a very prestigious scientist to be able to have the opportunity to be the editor of Nature. He wrote this editorial in the 1980s. Now you might say, look, John Maddox, you're a scientist. Scientists are just dispassionate searchers of the truth. They don't get biased by metaphysical or religious commitments or anything like that. So you say that the origin of the Big Bang itself is not susceptible to discussion. This view of the origin of the universe is thoroughly unsatisfactory. Well, why would it be unsatisfactory, Dr. Maddox? I mean, there must be some kind of unscientific reason, some evidence that you have why it's unsatisfactory. But then you write, creationists and those of similar persuasions seeking support for their opinions have ample justification in the doctrine of the Big Bang. That, I might say, is when and how the universe was created. Wait a second, Dr. Maddox. You're supposed to just be considered the evidence. It sounds like you're saying the Big Bang theory is unsatisfactory, not because the evidence is against it, but because it doesn't work with your atheism. And it gives support to the creationists, to the Christians. But Dr. Maddox, aren't you supposed to just follow the evidence wherever it leads? Or perhaps atheists aren't quite as neutral as they claim to be. Maybe they have their own biases and prejudice against theories as well. And I think that's clearly what's going on here, right? Stephen Hawking wrote this in his book, A Brief History of Time.
Many people do not like the idea that time has a beginning, probably because it smacks of divine intervention.
Right. So Hawking said a lot of this with the Soviet scientists didn't like it. But there was other people. Fred Hoyle was the scientist in a famous astrophysicist in the United Kingdom. He coined the word Big Bang as a derogatory way of referring to this theory. It was his way of making fun of it. Oh, it's a Big Bang, right? But now it caught on and it just accepted the term. But he opposed the Big Bang theory to his deathbed because it didn't agree with his atheism, or at least that certainly seems to be why he was doing that. So atheists have also, I don't think they've ever put anyone on trial the way Galileo did, but they have been hostile to the development of science because it didn't work with their worldview. All right, we need to finish up, so I'm going to skip a little part here, but I'm going to say it was John William Draper and Andrew Dixon White that are really responsible for this false view. And a lot of why this view became popular is because people wanted to oppose creationists in the whole evolution creation controversy. People wanted to oppose creationism. They wanted to keep Christianity in its place. It's important to realize that has been much of the motivation. It still happens today. Neil deGrasse Tyson did this series on TV. It was this documentary series. I forget what it's called. Cosmos? Yeah. A lot of this false conflict view was not explicitly stated there, but implicitly, indirectly, it was stated and encouraged and told. He could have set the record straight, but he chose not to, and he chose to imply that this false conflict view was correct. So you still get this coming out today. And the reason why it's so important for us to realize that this is false is because, we're talking about worldviews at this conference, right? Worldviews are like the lens through which you see the world around you. It's the lenses through which you interpret things, including Christians. We interpret evidence through a particular lens. So many times when you see an issue debated or discussed, like creation, evolution, intelligent design, free will and quantum physics, quantum mechanics, or the beginning of the universe and God, whatever it might be, people will listen to that debate or that discussion through a particular lens. I guess you shouldn't be lens, something on your ears or eyes or whatever, you know what I mean. They will understand that in a particular way based on this false conflict view. A lot of times people don't, like if you have two people debating this theory, you've got say a creationist on this side or intelligent design advocate and somebody espousing evolution over here. A lot of times people won't even really understand what they're saying, right? But nobody wants to say they don't understand because everybody wants to think everyone wants everyone else to think that they're smart and know what's going on, right? So you don't say anything, you just kind of nod and pretend, right? So you don't understand what they're saying, but you do know one thing. You know that this Christian person over here, they're on the side that has always opposed the advancement of science. They're the ones that are biased. They're the ones you can't trust. And even as Christians, we can feel that way, right? So when you hear this discussion, you're already thinking this person is wrong. You're suspicious of this person. And what I want you to know today is that's not the right way to see these issues. Now, I'm not saying who's right or who's wrong. It's a totally separate issue. Who is right, what is true, and those other debates. All I'm saying is when you approach those subjects, don't buy into the propaganda that says Christians have always been opposing the advancement of science. That is simply not true. Let's finish with one last quote, but I'm going to do a different one than I did before. Here's other myths. We don't have time for that. Let's skip this one and do one more. Can you read this for me?
The reason for promoting both the scientific lie about...
Specific lie.
Oh, sorry. The reason for promoting both the specific lie about the sphericity of the earth and a general lie that religion and science are in natural and eternal conflict in Western society is to defend Darwinism. The answer is really only slightly more complicated than that bald statement. The flat earth lie was ammunition against the creationists. The argument was simple and powerful, if not elegant. Look how stupid these Christians are. They are always getting in the way of science and progress. These people who deny evolution today are exactly the same sort of people as those idiots who for at least 1,000 years denied that the earth was round. How stupid can you get? But that is not the truth.
Okay, so you understand? Jeffrey Burton Russell, this historian, is saying, why does the flat earth myth, the idea that people in the Middle Ages thought the earth was flat, and this supposed conflict of science and religion, why does it keep going? Well, it's because it serves the purposes of certain people who want to oppose creationists, and even more broadly, people who want to oppose conservative Christians in the culture wars. I would add that part, right? And this is what the argument behind is the conflict thesis is. Look how stupid these Christians are. You can't trust them. When they doubt evolution, when they say God caused the Big Bang, they're the same people who said the earth was flat. How stupid can you get? Do you really want to trust those people? But Jeffrey Burton says, look, that is not true. Don't buy into this propaganda, this false view. This is not what mainstream, respected scholars have to say about the history of science and religion. Thank you.
Okay, so we're going to take about 10 minutes now just for some Q&A with Peter. So why don't we do that now? Go ahead.
Okay, right here.
Okay. So, thank you for the talk. So my question is that the major objection, I think, when we see that conflict between science and religion, the major objection from the science side is that science is about discovering the truth. So religion maintains claims the same, discovering the truth. So religion claims the truth was revealed, but the science claims that the truth has to be revealed.
Or discovered?
Found.
Okay.
Discovered, yes,
Yeah.
exactly. So the major divide is between approach and methodology, I probably we can say. So, how do you see? I can easily see how it's coming into a conflict here in this place, because when I'm saying okay, the truth is that I believe it. I believe in God. That's the way that I'm looking at the universe. So I can assume naturalism, methodological naturalism in my lab,
Yeah.
But that's it. So when I'm leaving my lab, I'm again I'm believing in God. So and the people on the other side, they're saying, no, I'm not leaving my methodological naturalism when I'm leaving my lab. I'm still sticking to this, even outside my lab, because it's science about discovering the truth.
Philosophical
Yeah, exactly. So why? So the question will be: so why do you object to scientific naturalism?
Methodological naturalism?
Methodological naturalism as a way of discovering the truth in a grand scale.
Okay, so let me explain some of the terms here. The idea is that a lot of this term methodological naturalism is different from philosophical naturalism. Naturalism is the idea that only natural causes in the universe. So there's no supernatural causes. So everything that is an effect or occurs has some natural cause behind it, right? If you insist this is true for all things everywhere in the universe all the time, that's philosophical naturalism. So that's saying there's no God or supernatural beings that do any supernatural things, right? If you want to have some God out there, it's going to have to be a deistic God. Maybe not even that, because there's no even like God that created the universe, right? So that's philosophical naturalism. And especially when it comes to evolution, creation, intelligent design, the argument against scientists is that they are believing in philosophical naturalism. They're committed to the idea that only natural causes occur, so they're not able to see any supernatural causes or works that God has done. But scientists have defended this and said, no, look, we're not assuming philosophical naturalism. We don't know if there's supernatural stuff or not. We're not trying to get into that game, right? But we're just assuming that everything has a natural cause. And we're assuming this so that we can do science. This is part of our methodology. The way we do science, we just always assume that there's some natural causes because that's how we discover. That's how science grows and develops new knowledge. If we always say there's some supernatural cause, then we can never discover new natural causes, new scientific theories, right? If we assume methodological naturalism, we just assume everything has a natural cause, then science develops and grows. But the defenders of methodological naturalism will say, look, religion might be true or might be right. We're not trying to say anything about that. We're just assuming methodological naturalism, and even a Christian or a Muslim or anybody can do that, right? So, that certainly could be the case. People could argue about whether that is the right way for science to progress. Some people would say, look, they're blinded to possible supernatural causes, right? So they should be open to supernatural or even an intelligent agent, if that's an alien, right? On the other hand, we could accept that as the right way for science to progress. But then what we should recognize is you can't then use science as an argument against religion, against Christianity, which is what the new atheists are commonly doing. If you know who the new atheists are, like Sam Harris, Richard Dawkins, and late Christopher Hitchens, and a few others, right? They often use science as an argument against religion. They say science is disproven religion, especially say, look, science is our best way of knowing truth, and we find no evidence, no theories that have God or supernatural beings in them in science. So that shows you that there's no reason to believe that God exists or supernatural entities exist. That's a bad argument. Why? Because science, as a condition, requires you to only look for natural causes. That's the way that science, by and large, in secular universities works today. They assume there's only natural causes. And that's fine, they can do that. But if they're assuming that from the beginning, you can't then use their conclusions to prove the assumption. Otherwise, you're just doing a circular argument. Right? If we play a soccer game, and I say every ball that goes into your net is 1 point for me, but every time you hit the ball into my net, doesn't count. That's not a point. And then I win the game. It proves I'm a better soccer player than you, right? That doesn't work. Or imagine if there's a murder here. Someone's dead. And the police come in, and they're looking at the evidence, and the police chief comes in and says, okay, guys, find the person who killed this person. You've got to find the murderer here. But only one thing. You can't arrest a white male. Not allowed to. Anybody else, but not a white male. Well, they're going to say, well, what if a white male did it? No, you're not allowed to arrest a white male. Well, you have a biased investigation there, right? You're not looking for the truth of who murdered the person. You're just trying to find who maybe did it that's not a white male, or how you can implicate someone, right? If science is only looking for the best natural explanation for everything, I think in many cases they are going to get the truth, because many times there is a natural cause. But if there is a supernatural cause, they're not going to be able to discover it because they're not allowed to. So you can't then use science to prove there is no supernatural cause, right? So that's, I mean, things can get a little more complicated, but I'll stop at that. Can I do one more question?
Absolutely.
Okay, let's do at least one more. Yeah.
Can you talk about Darwin?
Okay, good. So, with Charles Darwin, it's oftentimes like Galileo. Darwin was here, he was non-religious, maybe he was an atheist, just seeking after the truth, and then he proposed this theory because the evidence he supported, and then all the religious people, they were all angry and opposed to him because they didn't like the religious implications for them, right? That's not the right way to understand it. Same thing with Galileo. As soon as Darwin published his theory, there were Christians, religious people who liked his theory and promoted it. Now, I'm not saying whether they should or should not. I'm just saying that's what happened. Asa Gray was a very respected Harvard University scientist who was what we call an evangelical Christian today, promoted Darwinism and Darwin's theory a lot in the United States. A lot of Calvinists liked Darwin's theory. They were oftentimes, many of them were promoting. So there's many Christians who liked his theory and were promoting it. There were Christian people who were also opposed to his theory and didn't always like it too, that I've heard as well. But there were Christians on both sides of this issue. There were also scientists on both sides of this issue. There were scientists who liked Darwin's theory or were popularizing it and promoting it. But there were also scientists who were opposed to it, and they had good scientific reasons to oppose it. In fact, some of these reasons were so good that by the early 20th century, Darwinian or neo-Darwinism was considered a dead theory. One of the problems was, in order for Darwinian natural selection and the theory of common descent to occur, you had to have enough time. So what is natural selection? Natural selection is the idea that you have a certain organism, it reproduces. Every so often when it reproduces, it has a variation or a mutation, right? That variation or mutation a lot of times doesn't help the species to live and survive, or the organism, right? The offspring. But every so often, you can have an offspring with a variation that helps it to survive more. So if it can survive longer or survive easier or get more food, somehow survive, it's more likely to reproduce. If it's more likely to reproduce, it can pass on that variation, that mutation, to the next generation. And then that can happen again. And all these small little variations, mutations, can build up so that you don't have just small changes, you have bigger and bigger changes, and you have one species actually evolving into another species, right? So it's the theory of natural selection. And then that produced the idea of common descent, which is the idea that all of the different species originated in one organism that Darwin speculated was some kind of a cell that developed in some muddy pool with some lightning or things like that, right? He didn't really try to develop a theory there. His was just on the origin of species. That's what his book was talking about, not the origin of this first cell. So that was his theory. Now, in order for that to be plausible, in order for that work, you had to have enough time to make it plausible. If it's a very short period of time, it almost seems like you have to have God step in and do miracles to make these changes happen fast enough, right? So you have to have enough time in order for it to occur. In Darwin's day, one of the best physicists of that time, William Thomson, who was also called Lord Kelvin, used the best scientific data and theories of the time to estimate the age of the Earth, how long it's taken to cool. And based on his calculations, he was one of the top physicists around, there simply was not enough time to make Darwinian evolution occur. And that's why by the early 20th century, Darwin's theory was dead. People just said there's not enough time, it won't work. It was only later on when they discovered radioactivity and they realized there could be a lot more time than was originally thought, that they said, oh, okay, now it's plausible. Of course, one thing to notice, if the complexity of an organism increases enough, and you don't get more time, eventually you have to conclude, no, this won't work still. And in fact, that's what we've been having the last 100 years, and that's what a lot of the people in the intelligent design movement are arguing for. But I don't want to get into that because I need to finish. And so let me just finish off by saying, first, thank you all for coming. But two, if you're interested in talking more, I'm around, I'm happy to talk about it.